Here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to wait a few moments while we let our attendees enter into the webinar. If you have any questions throughout the event, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to go ahead and submit questions. Thank you, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us. We're going to get started in just a few minutes while we let our attendees enter the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit some questions. We also have transcription active at the bottom of your screen. You can enable that as well. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're just waiting a few minutes while we let our attendees enter the webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and put them in the Q&A button at the bottom throughout the event. As well, we also have transcription enabled for the event. You can also find that at the bottom of your screen. Thank you for your patience. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. We just have about 1 more minute while we wait for some more attendees to enter the webinar. Feel free to enter any questions you have in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We also have live transcriptioning enabled, and we'll get started in just a minute.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vice Chancellor Renee Navarro. Welcome to today's conversation. As a part of the UCSF Anti-Racism Initiative, today we present a conversation with Chancellor Hawgood and Dean Dayna Bowen Matthew. It is a privilege and my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dayna Bowen Matthew, Dean and Harold Green Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. A national leader and a legal scholar in civil rights law and public health policy, Dr. Matthew focuses on the persistent racial disparities we see in healthcare. A trailblazer, Dean Matthew is the first Black woman to lead George Washington Law. Dean Matthew previously served as the University of Virginia Law School's William Matheson and Robert Morgenthau Distinguished Professor of Law and the F. Palmer Weber Research Professor of Civil Liberties and Human Rights. She was also a professor of public health sciences at the UVA School of Medicine and served as co-founder and inaugural director of the Equity Center at UVA, a transdisciplinary unit working to build relationships between the university and its surrounding community to address racial and socioeconomic inequality. Prior to her tenure at UVA, she served as professor of law, associate dean, and vice dean of academic affairs at the University of Colorado Law School. And before that, as professor of law and of medicine at the University of Kentucky College of Law. Dean Matthew has also held a number of important policy positions. She served as the Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellow for U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow and as senior advisor in the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She also is a non-resident fellow in the Center for Health Policy at the Brookings Institution. A prolific writer, and perhaps she can tell us her time-making strategies. She is the author of the book, which I highly recommend to all of you, Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare. And she has authored or co-authored dozens of book chapters and articles focusing on healthcare reform, public health law, health disparities, patient protections, and antitrust laws and civil rights. Dean Matthew received a BA in economics from Harvard Radcliffe College, a JD from the UVA School of Law, and a PhD in health and behavioral sciences from the University of Colorado, Denver. As you can see, Dr. Matthew is the perfect person to help inform us as UCSF seeks to be a diverse and inclusive anti-racism institution. We are so delighted to have Dean Matthew with us today, and we look forward to today's conversation with Chancellor Hawgood. Chancellor?
Thank you very much, Renee and Dayna, if I may call you that. Welcome to UCSF. It's a great privilege to have you here for a conversation for the next hour. I want to start by congratulating you on being appointed a dean just 10 months ago. You picked one heck of a year to make that transition, but I'm sure that you are enjoying yourself and making a big impact already at George Washington.
I'm enjoying it a great deal. Thank you very much. It was a rollicking 12 months, 10 months so far, though.
Well, let's hope the remainder of 2021 is a turn for the better. Perhaps we could start by, if I could just ask you to give a little bit of your history. Renee gave a great introduction, but personalize it a little bit for me. Tell me about your journey, why you chose the direction that you chose, what drew you to the law, and then once in the law, what drew you to healthcare law and constitutional law, and a little bit to just personalize that introduction.
Well, thank you. It was quite an introduction. And Vice Chancellor Navarro, I just got to thank you and all of the incredible people who are already doing such amazing work here at UCSF. I'm very grateful to be counted someone that you'd listen to, because I know already how much you are doing and how far out ahead you are on the issues of attacking health disparities. So thank you for having me and for introducing me so generously. I think the only place to go after that kind of introduction is to tell you that it started when I grew up in the South Bronx, which is where I saw a vast difference between my life with my neighbors and the life that my parents struggled to give to me by busing me to another part of New York City called Riverdale. So my father died at the age of 49. My mother died at the age of 61. And they both died prematurely, making sure that I could get the life that people had in Riverdale, as opposed to the life that I had in the South Bronx, awaiting me had they not changed my structures and my stars. That disparity has really seared my memory because I know that many of the things that Dr. Navarro was so kind to compliment me about, the firsts, the accolades, the accomplishments, there were many, many people that lived with me and grew up with me in the South Bronx that could also have done similar things given the opportunities that I had, or my parents could still be with me and be passing on wisdom, perhaps even wealth to my children and their grandchildren if they had not suffered the disparities that I now study. So it's been personal for me, and I've decided to focus on law because it is a lever. It is an opportunity to make changes. The downside or the dark side of the fact that the law is a lever is the fact that the law has also been a mechanism to institutionalize the racial disparities and inequalities that produced my family's poverty, untimely death, and the disparate outcomes that I see still in my neighborhood today.
So, thank you for that. I noticed that in your bio, you made the move from Colorado to Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017. That's a date, obviously seared in infamy in Virginia. Could you just say a little bit about that move and the impact of that particular time to make a move like that?
Certainly. My welcome committee was the group of mostly young men, but also some young women who were chanting as they walked through the academical village at the University of Virginia, "Jews will not replace us into the oven. Jews will not replace us into the oven." I will say that the parallels from that August 2017 mob and the mob that challenged right down the street the count of the Electoral College vote on January 6th, 2021, that mob went in carrying Confederate flags, just as the mob did on August of 2017. That mob on January 6th went in with t-shirts saying 6 million Jews is not enough. The reason I raised both dates and parallels is to make 2 points. One, we are kidding ourselves if we think we're really making headway quite yet in the war against racism and the racism that produces the health disparities that we are all fighting together. But we're also kidding ourselves, secondly, if we think that these extremists represent the structural racism that actually is the source of health disparities. They are a product of, in many ways, a byproduct of an environment of much more acceptable and less flamboyant expressions of racism that are allowed to thrive in an environment that permits structural inequality and structural racism the way America does today.
I'd love to explore that distinction that you draw out so beautifully in your book, the book that Renee mentioned called Just Medicine. And for those that are listening, I would point out that you can read Dean Matthew's book online through the library, or actually withdraw a book. We have several copies in the library. But for me, one of the really important learnings for me personally in the book is how beautifully you make the distinction between the kind of explicit bigotry that you experienced in Charlottesville, or that we saw in the Capitol earlier this year, and implicit bias. Vice Chancellor Navarro has done a tremendous amount of work over the last decade, introducing the entire campus to the concepts of implicit bias, but you really put that front and center as one of the fundamental causes of the propagation and continuation of health disparities. So could you first make the distinction in your mind, what the important distinctions are beyond the obvious, and then why you chose in this particular book to focus so squarely on the issue of implicit bias as a fundamental pillar of health disparities?
The opportunity to make the distinction is welcome. It will also give me an opportunity to describe how my thinking has progressed since that book, as we academics often find ourselves doing and growing. So the distinction is implied versus explicit, very clear in those two words. Implicit bias is one that's unintentional. It happens because of stored social knowledge that we get environmentally. So you receive information about racial groups with whom you have little contact based on television, movies, music, newsreels, and the kind of political environment and debate that we experience. Those are in the environment and they send you messages about populations you have otherwise very little data to compare or to apply. That stored knowledge gets triggered or accessed the minute you encounter someone from that racial group, because you have little else to go on. So you use that stored stereotypical knowledge as a heuristic to make judgments unintentionally, not deliberately, and very often in contradiction to your express political and egalitarian proclivities. So if I asked you questions intending to discern whether you had explicit, that is overt, blatant prejudices, I don't like this group, I call another group by that name, I don't want to live in that neighborhood with those people, I don't want them marrying us, those kinds of explicit racial biases, you would deny them, I would deny them, and yet have very little control over the implicit or unintentional biases that are a reflection of stored social knowledge and involuntarily called up. Now, the literature is in quite a debate right now about how much and to what extent those implicit biases actually control your decision-making and control your conduct and choices. Well, we can talk about those intellectual debates, but for sure, we can see the result of implicit biases, people who don't intend to be racially biased, but construct and perpetuate systems that are. That is, we can see that the underrepresentation of underrepresented minority groups in the workforce, the vast difference in wealth of employment opportunities. Residential segregation thrives, and these structures are a result not of explicit overt laws, preferences that people continue to express today, but because of implicit, unspoken structures that continue to replicate the exact same result. So my thinking in the book was to focus on those individual level biases, to look for ways to de-bias individuals so that they had better communication with physician-patient relationships or made better treatment choices. Those continue to be important. And again, Vice Chancellor Navarro has an overwhelming majority of the population at your institution having had this training and awareness raising. That said, I've progressed in my thinking to realize that even individualized debiasing is insufficient because so many of the structures that produce the inequalities that are directly, and to use your term again, fundamental causes of health disparities are structures, not individual behaviors, are institutionalized, not whether they're conscious or unconscious, institutionalized instances of dehumanization. An example would be the dehumanization of people in Flint, Michigan, who to this day do not have clean drinking water, or in my hometown, the South Bronx, also known as Asthma Alley in the zip code from which I hail. These fundamental necessities of human life, when denied, are structural dehumanization, when racialized, reflects structural racism. And merely attacking individual implicit biases will be insufficient to defeat them.
That's terrific. You at the end of your 2015 book, Just Medicine, you clearly are moving in that direction. And you told me earlier that you're publishing a new book in the fall that more fully fleshes out some of those larger issues around social determinants and population health, which we are very much engaged in as well. But what we do on a day-to-day basis is the individual patient encounter, and that's where I found so many jewels in your book. And what I loved about your book, that, for instance, in the Institute of Medicine report in 2003, that was a powerful book. It brought unequal treatment to many people's attention, but it wavered on the issue of how important implicit bias was and was short on solutions. It was powerful in describing a problem. What I loved about your book is that you jumped into solutions fair and square, and you made, I think, a powerful case that just because implicit bias is subconscious, that doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done about it. And you use the terms malleability, connectedness, and of course, if we agree and acknowledge that implicit bias is in fact malleable, it introduces the concept of personal accountability. It's no longer just something that we can't control. It is in fact something that we can and should control. Could you just explore a little bit more about what the evidence is for malleability, change, personal accountability in this space?
So some of the evidence is, again, on the individualized level. Alexander Green did a study of some 237 physicians in primary care. Some were internal medicine doctors, others were general practitioners. And a subset of those they had the disclosure that the study was about race and treatment. The majority didn't. And what he found as he looked at the correlation between implicit bias as measured by the implicit association test and treatment decisions, comparing a treatment of choice, thrombolysis in this experiment, and sort of suboptimal treatments, alternatives, by race and ethnicity. What he found was that there was a correlation between an increasing racial bias score and whether the physician provided the treatment of choice to white or Black patients. These were all vignettes. They were all similarly situated by every type of test, evidence, clinical evidence, and their histories. And the only thing that was different was race and gender. And he's found a regression correlation between those two variables. Increases in bias as measured by the IIT, increased the treatment of choice being given preferably to whites over Blacks. However, that subset that we referred to in the same experiment, who knew that they were being asked to consider their treatment decisions as pertained to racially disparate groups, had a exactly reverse correlation. So there was something about knowing, being alerted to the problem, that allowed self-correction. Now, sadly, that self-correction has to compete with, as I spoke of earlier, the environmental data, the social knowledge that continues to bombard. And so a momentary transformation as a result of one training or one seminar is not enough. Structurally, again, we must look at the results of bias and how to dismantle them if we want long-term change.
As an educational institution, we're obviously charged with the heavy responsibility of training the next generation of healthcare providers, whether they're doctors, nurses, pharmacists, dentists, or scientists looking for discoveries to help the human race. How much of a generation gap is there in these understanding of implicit bias, and does that change over a lifetime? Your studies of students compared to older practitioners in the healthcare space. What lessons are there for us as we think about the time course?
I'm going to say it in a provocative way, just to make sure that audience members remember this as my answer. The older members of the health profession are less clever at disguising implicit and explicit bias than the younger generation, but the biases remain unchanged, the evidence would suggest. One of the most troubling studies had nothing to do with the IIT. I choose to highlight it because of, as I said, some of the controversy around the IIT and what it does and does not measure. But at the University of Virginia, my former institution, which is forward-thinking in some of the same ways that this institution is, a study was done of third-year medical students, and they were asked for their biases, explicit biases, against patients of color, Black patients in particular, in pain studies. So this particular study featured a list of patently false statements about how Black versus white patients experience pain. I'm summarizing the study, of course, not doing it total justice, but you'll get my drift quite quickly, I think. So among the statements about why Blacks and whites might experience pain differently were statements that are, again, scientifically and patently untrue. Blacks have thicker skin and therefore experience pain less readily. They have a higher bone density, and that affects their pain experience. Another fallacious statement was that Blacks' blood coagulates differently than whites. All of these were patently false. But there was a correlation between the number of false statements that current third year medical students believed and their probability of treating pain for Blacks similarly to the way that whites were treated. This may be one of the reasons, as a parenthetical aside, that the tragic opioid crisis is a predominantly white and male crisis, a predominantly white crisis. And that is because there is still virulent biases among young physicians in training concerning the differences between Black and white patients, at least with respect to pain, this study would suggest. And again, I return to structural changes that would have to occur. We'd have to change the way we teach medical education. I mean, the curriculum will have to reflect an assumption of implicit bias and the social knowledge that would reinforce it, and countermeasures, counterfactuals that have been proved important and lasting in their ability to dismantle those biases. Some would include, again, diversifying the leadership ranks of important institutions, right? So Dr. Navarro is an important example. Having someone in leadership, having diverse teams make decisions, making sure that there are objective measures, that data is collected, reviewed, and reacted to by race, by ethnicity, by socioeconomic status. These are some of the important steps that I know have been taken at UCSF and should be taken nationally in order to dismantle structural racism.
Thank you for that. I know our five deans are in the audience here this afternoon, and they are all committed to doing major curricular overhaul along the lines that you've spoken about. But it It is a continuing effort, and it is hard work. I mentioned that one of the things that really appealed to me in your book, because frequently it's easy to find an enormous literature that defines the problem. It's harder to find literature that points in the direction of solutions. And again, I'll speak at the moment on the individual encounter front. We can move to the larger population institutional issues in a little bit, but on the individual encounter front, that so many of our trainees and graduates are engaged in every single day. You introduced the biased care model with 6 different mechanisms that you feel where implicit bias interacts with and disrupts the patient relationship bidirectionally, but where the outcome is disparate outcomes. Could you just explain what that model is? And I particularly like the way you use the model to think about before the encounter, during the encounter, and after the encounter. So it's a long question. I'll let you take it wherever you want. But and again, I would just encourage the audience to read the book themselves, because it's compelling. But
thank you for that. That's kind. The bias care model attempts to do very one straightforward thing, and that is connect individual biases to population health outcomes. It suggests different pathways through which those individual biases might, in fact, produce biased health outcomes, because as you said, the Institute of Medicine report, the consensus report, now the National Academies of Medicine, that was published in 2003, has aggregated many studies, now replicated hundreds of times over, to show us the disparate outcomes in various disease modalities, various settings. These are replicated, whether it's death due to different cancers, diabetes, higher rates of death by homicide, any number of outcomes. We're making small progress on some, but the bias care model attempts to say there is a proliferation of opportunities, pathways through which an individual's untreated implicit and unintentional bias can travel in various parts of the medical and clinical encounter to the patient experience, and ultimately to patient outcomes. So the model offers 6 different potential pathways supported by the literature that include, for example, the Dr. Alexander Green study is a part of a group of large literature that talks about treatment decisions. That's a pathway. Biased treatment decisions are reflected, are of a reflection of implicit bias that can change patient treatment. You talked about the bidirectionality of communication. Another very, very well documented series of studies coming out of Johns Hopkins, looking at the clinical encounter and how they differ between patient and physician when there is similar or concordant racial coincidence in their diet and when there is not. So if I look at you and I have some assumptions about you and I'm your doctor, you're my patient, I might transmit those assumptions by the length of my clinical encounter. How long do I stay with you? How comfortable do I appear in the clinical encounter? How close to you do I sit? How dominating am I in the conversation? How much or little do I credit your report of pain? How much do I assume you are able to comply with or not comply with, have the resources, and so forth? These assumptions I transmit to you unintentionally, and you pick them up as my patient. You look at me and you say, that's not a warm physician. That's not someone I wish to have a continuing relation. I don't trust that person. And that disturbs the continuity of care because you'll leave and not come back. I'll have lost you to follow up. You will have had an unsatisfactory experience. And the bias that I brought into the office as physician and that you brought into the encounter as patient is another set of pathways through which implicit bias can travel and ultimately detrimentally harm patient outcomes. So the bias care model attempts to look at the literatures that suggest bias and outcomes are connected and show that there are multiple pathways, even in institutions and individuals that have the best of intentions.
And each of those pathways, you outline specific tools, potential interventions to improve them. You use the word just then, best intentions, and for me, one of the issues that you raise is the term aversive racism, where you have this combination of very low explicit bias or best intentions, very high best intentions. But when that's coupled with a high score on the IAT or a high implicit bias, that's a very damaging conversation to the physician-patient relationship. So could you expand on the term aversive racism, what it means, and why it is such a damaging combination?
Yes, I credit Dr. Lewis Penner at Wayne State University for really developing the literature on aversive racism. And it is exactly as it sounds, someone who behaves in a racist manner but has an aversion to it. These are people who, and the reason, in direct answer to your question, it's so dangerous for the quality of patient care is because it's shown in Dr. Penner's studies and in others that these are the people that patients react most negatively to. They have the lowest level of patient satisfaction scores when the combination of low explicit, I'm an egalitarian, I may even be a progressive, I may be a liberal, explicitly, but implicitly, I have not checked my biases because I assume I am just fine. I'm fairly fragile, that is, not open to the suggestion of change, because I'm pretty sure that I'm on the right side of the social spectrum in this regard. That combination of certainty, not for no reason. I mean, it is a good thing that the person at issue is a person who's not explicitly racist, would not appear at the Capitol with a Confederate flag, for example. I think that's a good thing. The dangerous thing is that that person doesn't realize that they too are transmitting the type of dissatisfaction with, aversion to, and stereotypical presumptions about populations with whom they have very little encounter. This goes to, again, the structural racism of our residential segregation system, right? I don't live near you, you don't live near me, my children don't go to school with you, your children don't go to school with me. Our educational chances are so different, our experiences are so disparate that we must make assumptions about one another. And an aversive racist is someone that reads the right newspapers, speaks the right language, maybe even votes with equality in mind, but because they have zero experience in real life with people of different races, or minimal experience with people of different races in a real personal encounter to develop long-term relationships, they signal the same type of racism. Patients really respond negatively to that combination called an aversive racist.
Thank you. Switching now from the individual encounter to the area that your new book is going to focus on, and that is the institutional biases, structural racism, and how that plays out in the healthcare pyramid that we're aware of here at UCSF, and that you bring to your readers' attention in the current book. COVID-19, the year we've just been in, is possibly, if we ever needed a wake-up call about the impact of that sort of larger institutional structural racism and the implications that has. It's played out during the pandemic. Were there any surprises during the pandemic for you, or was it completely predictable? And are there lessons that you would take away that have changed your thinking as a result of what we have experienced and hopefully learned from during the pandemic?
I'm afraid it was completely predictable. And very little of it was surprising. The thing that I want to linger on in terms of a positive note is that the pandemic gives us an opportunity like we've never had before to really actualize the lessons that we've seen brought to the fore. Those of us that have studied racism as a fundamental cause of health disparities could have predicted not only the disparate morbidity and mortality of patients of color, so that Indigenous Americans, Native Americans have, in some parts of the country, 4 times the likelihood of death and hospitalization of whites, but also the disparate uptake of the vaccine, the disparities in treatment. I've recently written and called it white supremacy at its worst, or perhaps at its best, right? That white populations have been able to access 2/3 of the vaccine that has been distributed, and Latinx populations, maybe 13%, Black populations, 9%, Asian populations, less than 3%, and the only population that has a higher uptake of the vaccine than it does hospitalization case rates and death rates are whites, right? So that's white supremacy, if you will. But to go to the positive side, what are the lessons that we can learn from this predictable tragedy? What are the lessons that we can take away? I want to speak to your audience about personal responsibility, a phrase that you raised earlier. I want to use it now to say, as we understand that these structures will continue to replicate, not only to the death, to the detriment, but to the death of populations, we become morally responsible as individuals to play our part in reversing the racism that has produced these deadly outcomes, right? We have an object lesson right before us. No one is exempt, and especially not those in the health professions. Why do I say this? For a number of reasons. First and foremost, because the tragedy is quantifiable, and you can see the extent, measure the extent tangibly of the structural racism that we are seeing, and therefore have a very clear target at which to aim. Number 2, it's also very clear to me that historically, the legal interventions that have meant the most, that have changed outcomes from a civil rights perspective, most dramatically, have required the leadership and input of members of the health professions. I'm thinking about the Medical Committee on Civil and Human Rights that marched on Washington to achieve Title VI and the Civil Rights Act of 1965, right? I'm thinking about the physicians and dentists that served as plaintiffs in the watershed case, Simpkins versus Cone, that not only led to that civil rights legislation, but in fact were responsible for dismantling overt segregation in over 7,000 hospitals through the Medicare Act and compliance and enforcement. Leadership among healthcare providers is essential, and personal responsibility, I think now, requires for healthcare providers to take leadership in an understood tragedy and crisis that few can quantify and few can impact as directly as members of the health profession can.
Thank you. So I'm going to last few questions from me that will directly draw on your role as a constitutional lawyer. And then we'll take some questions from the audience, if that's okay. You mentioned Title VI, and you and I discussed earlier that we have a proud history, and that one of my predecessors as Chancellor here, Philip Ali, worked in the Johnson administration around the Medicare Act, and one of his major contributions was to make sure that Medicare money only went to desegregated hospitals. And in fact, our Institute for Health Policy here is named the Philip Lee Institute for Health Policy. But back to Title VI, scares me when I start to talk about the Constitution with a lawyer, I have to say. So I'm going to keep my questions brief and let you expound. But one of the really, I think, challenging, and I'm sure it was challenging by purpose towards the end of the book, is really making the case that there is a case to make implicit bias illegal. That Title VI did not do that. It only made explicit acts of bigotry and racism illegal. And that you call for reform of Title VI and Title VII. So could you, that's as far as I'm going to go before I put my foot in it, but can you take it from there and talk a little bit about why you are suggesting that, and where you think the world is in terms of moving in that direction?
Yes, I will. Law changes the social norm or the environment for social norms. It cannot change behavior itself. And so the changes that I suggest in the book are important reflections of a changed social norm. Just as in 1964, 5, 6, 7, and 8, the changes in social norms that were ushered in by changes in Title VI, meaning that they were passed, had to be implemented by hospitals, physicians, clinicians, health providers, going door to door and identifying institutions that did and did not, you said, Dr. Lee, obey the civil rights laws. Those that did not get funding, those that did. That was laborious work that had to follow the change in law. So I'll start now by first talking about the change in law that would change the social norms today. We've discussed implicit bias, unintentional racism, and how it creates and reinforces structures. Those structures are outcomes. And it is my hope that we can empower the law to morph along with racism. Racism has become less explicit, more covert, less blatant, and more undercover. And the law must seek to eke out those undercover, implicit expressions of bias. How? By focusing on outcomes and making institutions responsible for the interventions that have been shown by social scientists to be effective, right? So it is my hope that we could transform Title VI from a general prohibition against overt and intentional discrimination by race, by color, by national origin, which any intelligent racist knows how to avoid now, right? I don't leave you the kind of evidence that I would need as a lawyer to put on in court. Think about the questions if you've watched any of those litigation shows, right? It's akin to asking, and when did you stop beating your spouse? Are you a racist? No, I'm not. That is the heart cry of the racist. Are you an anti-racist? Well, I can make you that by incentivizing you to make the kinds of interventions that have been shown by social scientists to change racist structures, right? So examples would include, it has been shown that when we have a proliferation of Dr. Renee Navarro's in leadership throughout a health institution, right? Not just putting tokenism into the lower ranks. When we change, secondly, the curriculum to reflect a public health that is population health outcome, that focus and preventative health focus, when we incentivize the kind of collaborative partnerships that will directly address the social determinants of health and how they are distributed in discriminatory ways, then you'll stop hearing the kind of excuses that are so common now. I did not go to medical school to solve poverty. Those are issues way outside of my area of expertise. Those are not medical, those are social, those are political. I wash my hands of the political. If we have a law reformed as I've suggested in the back of the book, so that the outcomes of implicit bias, of structural racism, are held to the account of institutions that produce them, then we will have incentivized the kind of behavior that will find solutions, right? How did we desegregate hospitals? We withheld money, right? The building named after Dr. Lee is so named because he found a way to withhold Medicare reimbursements for those institutions that continued to insist on segregated wards. We should do the same with respect to those institutions that have not taken the steps to intervene in a way that significantly produces equitable health outcomes. It's within their power to do so, And by regulating their access to federal funding, by regulating their exposure to liability, it would change their conduct and behavior in a meaningful way.
Thank you. As a leader of an institution that could be held so accountable, I completely resonate with the responsibility, and it sends a shiver up my spine in terms of the accountability required. But thank you for that. My last question to you is, in these conversations that I have with folks outside of UCSF 3 or 4 times a year, one of the things that I like to learn from each of our speaker is some of the lessons they've learned about being a leader. You've been a leader throughout your career. 10 months ago, you took on the role of a dean, a very important leader in law. What do you think is your philosophy about leadership and mentorship? And if I was to ask some of your students or some of your faculty, what they see in you as a leader, what do you think the answer I would get?
It's early, and this sends a shiver up my spine, right? I'm wondering what the answers will be. I like to tell people in my current organization that every day I come to work and I see what we in the law call an issue of first impression. Most of the problems that face me each and every day I've never seen before. I've never been asked to solve these problems before. I hope that if you asked what type of leader I am, people would say that my leadership is predictable because it's principled, that my values are clear, that I use them as a guide, a lodestar for what decision-making I must make. So if I don't know the answer, if I've never seen it before, one can rest assured at the values and the principles that will guide whatever choice I make, even if it's a first impression, question of first impression. So I hope that's what they will say, that I'm a leader whose principles are clear and I follow them and implement my values in every situation. That's what I'm hoping they would say.
I'm sure they would as well. So let me turn now to questions from the audience. We have about 10 minutes left. Although we're a healthcare university, this first question is from an attorney. So I'll just read it out. As an attorney, I love your discussion of the law and history of Title VI and Title VII. However, I worry that the huge transactional costs and inefficiencies in litigation that would be associated with a return to a private right of action under Title VI would be large, and would we do better to redirect those resources towards the elimination of social determinants?
I would argue.
You should explain to the audience what private right of action means.
Yes, let me answer directly first and then explain. I would argue, no, that the transactional costs are not that high because they would change the social norms, especially if, this is lawyer speak to the lawyer in the question, the standard of care, which I'm suggesting is reasonableness, that's a negligence standard, creates a defense so that if the defendant is able to show I took reasonable steps supported by data and the social science, then that defense actually is affirmative and their liability is protected against. What does that do? That incentivizes the changes that you seek, that is the questioner seeks, to redirect resources, not directly, but indirectly through litigation, a powerful motivator. I need a seminal case. I need to create an environment in which the risk of litigation is greater than the cost of avoiding litigation. And thereby I'm redirecting the resources of the institution towards avoiding litigation, therefore investing in social determinants of health. That's why I believe that the transaction costs are actually not that high. It's more the incentives that will have an effect when I successfully change the standard to include a private right of action. That was true empirically. One of the things I was able to show in my next book is that empirically, when the private cause of action existed and the standard before Washington v. Davis was not intentionality, then correctives in leading litigation against, for example, residential segregation were much more effective than they are today. So we only need a couple of sample cases, if you will, that will return that private right of action to people who are highly motivated, those who are affected by the discrimination, not those who are administratively charged with derivative lawsuits, but those who are directly affected, the dentist who could not get his patient admitted to Moses H. Cohen Hospital, right? The patients who were excluded from long-term care facilities. Those are highly motivated plaintiffs with direct stake, direct skin in the game, if you will. They will litigate, create a precedent and a new social norm that will thereby redirect resources towards the social determinants of health, I believe.
Thank you. And if I interpreted the argument that you made is you were really going after institutional responsibility versus individual responsibility when it comes to risk of litigation.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Even if you think about HIPAA, which everybody's afraid of violating HIPAA now. And it's because structurally institutions are held accountable for protecting patient privacy.
Right.
They create courses and certifications, and no longer do we see records handled carelessly, because the institution is what we call in economics the cheapest cost avoider. They have the most control over the outcomes and behaviors of those in their organizations, and they have the least expensive interventions at their fingertips. That enforcement is something we can leverage by creating a legal environment that holds them accountable.
This is a relatively long question, but I think it's an important one, and I'll read it quickly. For those of us who are engaged in the work of debiasing, as well as working on larger structural anti-racism work, we sometimes encounter individuals who counter our work with comments along the lines of, "I worry for white males. They are now endangered and losing opportunities." Do you have any rhetoric that helps get across to people who feel threatened by anti-racist work that this work is necessary despite being hard for some groups to give up some of their historic power and privilege?
I have so many things to say on this. Let me see if I can boil it down to one topic of impact that I hope will be impactful. When we say racism, we talk about a structure that contradicts at the core who we want to be as a country, who we claim to be as a country, who we desire and aspire to be as a people. There's empirical data that tells us that chasm between who we say we want to be and aspire to be and who we are is detrimental to the health of all populations, whether white or black, male or female, young or old. Racism hurts all of our health. And so by correcting and aligning ourselves with the egalitarian instincts that formed our country, right? The Declaration of Independence that purported to say that all men, and I assume eventually women, were created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights that require us to emblazon upon the Supreme Court's door equal justice for all. Aligning ourselves with those aspirations is going to improve the quality and longevity of life for us all. We know this empirically. And so for those white males who feel endangered, I say you're actually in danger of becoming your best selves and living in the society you created, hoped to create, that is to say, purport to create. And equality is really good for you as it is for anybody else. This is not a charity case. It's making our country who we want to be. Last thing I'll say is this, a little less generous, a little less charitable. When a system has been structured so long along the lines of creating historic, legally enforced advantage for some, merely losing that advantage appears to be a detriment, a loss. And in fact, it's not a loss at all. It is a reversal of unearned, unjust enrichment. And that should not threaten you. Again, that should encourage you that we can be who we say we were created to be, and thereby be better for all of us.
Thank you. Move to another question. How do you think that class, poverty, and privilege should guide us understanding racial disparities in health equity? I think the question is getting at the intersectionality of poverty, privilege, and race.
All of these are very important, but one of the things that is really clear from the data, the work of Bruce Phelan and Joe Link, it might be Bruce Lincoln, Joe Phelan, excuse me, Lincoln Phelan, demonstrates that socioeconomic status is an independent fundamental cause of health disparities, apart from and different than racism itself, right? And here I feel it's really important for me to describe what racism is. I borrow from Kamara Jones's definition. Racism is a structure, a system. It's not individual prejudice. It's not individual bias. Racism is a system that historically does two things. It creates a hierarchy of who's valuable and who's not valuable, of who's supreme and who's inferior. And then secondly, allocates resources, opportunity, housing, clean air, clean water, education, allocates resources, opportunity, and power along the lines of that hierarchical ordering, which in itself is false. That's what racism is, right? So dismantling racism is to dismantle those dehumanizing valuations that are fundamentally untrue, and then to equalize access to opportunity, right? Not outcomes, but to opportunity. Equalizing opportunity is what is meant by dismantling structural racism. I hope that answers the question, but I wanted to.
Yep, thank you very much. I'm going to move to the very last question, but thank you for holding over 700 people in rapt attention for the last hour, and questions are still coming in. And I'm sure that you will have begun some very important conversations that will continue on our campus for weeks and months to come. So I thank you for that. Let me ask the last question, and we'll end the session with your answer. Given your personal and professional experience, Dean Matthew, are you hopeful?
I am. In a very tragic way, the pandemic makes me hopeful. So we've just come out of a season where my faith tradition has celebrated Easter, where the death of one person is understood to bring life to many. At the same time, we're coming out of the Passover season, where Jews celebrate the bringing of life from the death of many. And we're coming out of Ramadan, in which Muslim communities introspectively look for hope in the future. It feels to me as though we're at an inflection point, which the entire nation has riveted its attention on the deadly outcome of inequality. We've seen it in the loss of 575,000 lives, the disparate treatment of interventions and miracle drugs intended to save those lives. And we've had the opportunity to pause and reflect on what can be done by each of us. So I am hopeful. And I do believe that this is an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime for each of us in this audience, on this call, to make a difference. And I believe that we will.
Thank you. And thank you again for a wonderful hour of very rich conversation. Appreciate you spending the time with us. I mentioned that behind me is the Chase Center, and I hope in a better world in a few months, we'll be able to actually welcome you in person to campus and have some entertainment as well. To the audience, the 700 odd that were listening this afternoon, I would ask you, the session has been recorded and will be available online in the near future, to speak to your colleagues and encourage them to take an hour out of their busy lives and listen to Dean Matthew and the very wise words that she shared with us today. Dean Matthew, thank you again. On behalf of UCSF, we appreciate your wisdom and we appreciate the work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.